All right, welcome to another video. This video is going to be how to do a charcoal portrait drawing using a photo reference and using something called the grid method. The grid method is an amazing tool to help artists match proportions accurately, but also if you want to make your drawing larger than the size of your photo reference, we can easily use the grid method to scale up on the size. So that's what we're doing today. I'm briefly going to show you what materials we're using for this project. You're going to need your drawing board. Please excuse, mine is very dirty, but you get the idea. We've got the 18 by 18 inch drawing board here, which is going to be large enough for what we're working on today. And you're going to need a sheet of, this is called toned drawing paper or charcoal paper or pastel paper. There's a lot of different names for what this is, and it comes in a lot of different brands, and all the brands kind of call it something different. But in general, when you go to the art store, you want to look for this type of paper that you can draw on, and usually on the packaging it will say, you know, good for charcoal and pastels and things like that. But if you get a pad, you know, you can have a lot of papers and there's a lot of different size options. But if you just want a page just for this project, you can get them in single sheets. You can purchase a single sheet of this type of paper at the art store, and they come in all different colors. But I would recommend a neutral mid-value color. So I have a gray here. It's not super dark, not super light. It's right in the middle of that value scale. So anything neutral like that will work, but this is a large sheet. That's usually what you find when you're just purchasing a single sheet of this paper, is that they're large sheets. But don't worry, we're going to trim it down to the right size that we need for today, okay? So that's the paper. You're going to need an 18-inch metal ruler or any kind of 18-inch ruler. The pencils we are using are black charcoal pencil, a 2B and a 4B. And as you can see, I've already sharpened my charcoal pencils to a nice long point. That gives us a lot more options on how we can draw the type of lines, and when we're filling in the values and things like that, this is how you want to sharpen them. So I use a utility knife and sandpaper, and I have a separate video that I show my students on how to sharpen your pencils to a long point. So you've got the 2B and 4B black charcoal pencils. Any brand is fine. They're all pretty much the same. And one white pencil, as you can see, also sharpened to a long point. You can use a white charcoal pencil or a white pastel pencil. Either one will work, okay? I've got a white pastel pencil here that I'm going to use today. You're going to want a kneaded eraser, these gray erasers that artists typically like to use. They work great. And you're going to need some white artist tape. I think this is somewhere around an inch thick, but artist tape is a low tack tape. It's less likely to tear your paper than any other type of tape, so that's why it has to be artist tape. And you are going to need a reference photo. Now, this is a portrait drawing, so you can either set up your own photograph. You know, you could photograph yourself, you could photograph a friend or a family member. That's kind of a really great option because it makes it more personal to you. You can set up the lighting to have a single light source, so you get shadows, and you just have a little more control of what you get when you take your own photo. However, you could find a reference photo online if you would prefer to draw something that already exists. However, you definitely want to make sure that it's a high resolution, clear photo. so that when you print it out at 8 by 10, it's going to look crystal clear, no blurry or grainy photos. So that's the first thing. You want to make sure that that there is a wide range of value represented in the photo. So you don't want something that's super bright and washed out with no dark values, and on the flip side, you don't want something that's all in shadow and all dark values. You want to have a range, so that way we really get to practice drawing with a full range of value, okay? And typically when there's a type of lighting situation that gives you that full range of value, it also typically makes the image look more three-dimensional, as opposed to, for example, the very kind of like popular Instagram portrait that has the lighting straight on where it washes people out and they just look flat. We don't want that. We want 3D. So let me show you an image I found online that I decided to use for my drawing today. As you can see, super clear photo. It's a portrait that has a wide range of value represented in the photo, and you can tell that there's kind of like a single light source on the subject. So we get a lot of shadows, a lot of light areas, and there's just a lot to work with here. And I made sure to print it out at 8 by 10. So as you can see, I'm using the typical printer paper, the 8.5 by 11 size, but the image is 8 by 10. That's very important if you want to follow along to not have to do any math to figure out how to do this project. Then follow my instructions for these dimensions. Otherwise, you're going to have to do the math on your own to make this work. But if you don't want to do the math, then follow my instructions. 8 by 10 for your image, okay? So you want to have that printed out and ready to go. Now, like I mentioned, this is a large sheet. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use my ruler to measure out the size that I need. I'm going to trim it down, put it on my drawing board, and then I'll show you the next steps. All right, so after you choose your reference photo, the next step is you're going to need a grid on top of your photo. You can use a pencil or a pen for this, and I might use this photo for another demo video. So I'm actually gonna use, or I already used, tracing paper to trace my image so that I could do the grid on that. But if you don't have tracing paper, that's totally fine. You can do your grid directly on your reference photo. But what I did was I traced the image, and I'm going to do my grid on that. And again, that's just because I want to protect my photo. But if you guys don't have tracing paper, then just do this step directly on your reference photo. You're going to need your ruler, and you can use a pencil or a pen. Just make sure if you use a pencil that it's nice and sharp. And so your image is 8 by 10, and your grid boxes are going to be 1 by 1 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and make a mark at each 1 inch increment. And bring my lines all the way across. So right now I'm doing my horizontal lines, and then I'll do my vertical ones. So make sure that you measure correctly and carefully, and make sure that the boxes that you end up with, or the grid, that they are square boxes. If you end up with rectangles, then you probably did not measure correctly, okay? So again, these are going to be 1 by 1 inch squares. All right, so now I'm going to do my 1 inch increments going vertically. All right, now once I have my grid, I'm just gonna label the columns and rows so that once I actually start the transfer process, it's just gonna be easy for me to keep track of which square I'm working on. So let's do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and then we'll do numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All right, so now that we have the grid on the reference here, we're gonna now need a grid on our paper. And you can probably guess how this is gonna go because the grid is gonna help us transfer. So the grid has to have the same exact amount of squares as the reference so that it translates, but this piece of paper is larger. Okay, so my piece of paper is 14 by 17 inches, but I'm gonna give myself a 1 inch border. So my actual drawing size will end up being 12 by 15. So let me go ahead and give myself a 1 inch border. This way, at the end of the drawing, I will have a nice presentation. And also, 12 by 15 is the size that I want my drawing to be. I've already done the math for you guys for making sure that the grid works out in terms of size and the size of the squares that I'm going to instruct you. So if you don't want to do any math, then follow my exact dimensions. If you don't follow the dimensions, you're going to have to figure out how it will translate properly. Okay, so now that I have my border mapped out, I'm going to use my artist tape to mask it off because this is going to be a charcoal drawing. Charcoal is messy and we want to keep our borders nice and crisp. Now this artist tape is the most low tack tape that you can find. It's not very likely to tear your paper, but just for extra insurance, what I like to do is I will use, my pants or just any piece of cloth. I'll stick it on that first, and that makes it even less tacky. So I'm a lot less likely to tear my paper. So that's what I usually do here, because this tape is going to stay on until we're done with the drawing. All right, so I've got the tape on. Now I'm ready for my grid. So your grid sizes for this one are going to be 1.5 inches, okay? So I'm gonna go ahead and map that out, and I'm using an HB pencil. Either an HB or a 2B graphite pencil will work for this. Just make sure that you are using a really light touch with your lines. Obviously you gotta be able to see your lines, but you don't wanna like press too hard, otherwise that could really interfere with the drawing, and you know, eventually we're going to erase these lines, so we just want them to be really nice and light, okay? All right, so now that I have my 1.5 inch squares on my grid, I'm going to label in the same way that I did here. So I've got A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So this is an important step, not only so that it's easy for us to look back and forth and keep track of which square that we're working on, but it's also important because this is just a way to double check to make sure you did your measuring properly and that you ended up with the same amount of squares on here that you have here. So it should be 8 squares going one way and 10 squares going the other way, okay? So now what we're gonna do is you can either continue with the pencil for the contour lines, or you can switch to a 2B charcoal pencil. Either way, you just want to make sure that your lines are super light. You don't want harsh contour lines. The contour lines, you know, they should be visible but super, super light. We are going to transfer our contour lines. Okay, so hopefully you can see that all right. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go square by square and copy my the information in here. So just think about the contour lines. You know, if your grid is on top of your drawing, try not to get distracted by all the little details. In fact, that's why I traced my contour lines, because it's easier for me to see it. But again, you don't have to use tracing paper for that step. If you don't have tracing paper, if your grid is directly on your photo, just try to go with outlines of things, like the outline of his face, the outline of his eye. Don't color anything in, it's just lines. The outline of his glasses, just the outline of the overall shape of the hair is fine. So ignore all the little detail stuff, okay? So, for example, if I want to start at the top, I would say, okay, so which box do I start seeing stuff in? It would be this third box over right here. So 1, 2, 3, okay, in this box. So I keep one finger here, and then my drawing hand, I am going to work in this box, and I'm just going to copy what I see over here. So what I see is the edge of the hair kind of starts near the center of that box, and then it curves up until it touches almost that top corner, just about there. And that's all I see from this box. Well, actually, I see one little part of the hair here, right there. Okay, so now this line continues one box over, so I'm going to move my finger over to the next box so that I'm looking back and forth as I go to try to keep things organized. And I'm trying to pay real close attention to where in the box these lines go. So take your time, really be thoughtful. If you don't take your time and rush it, then your line work is probably not going to be very good proportions. It's probably not going to look very accurate. So just take your time. As you can see, I'm using a really light touch as I go. I can see my lines, but they're not super, super dark, right? Okay, so I think the hairline is about here. We've got a little curl in the hair there. And in this box, this line meets that one, and this line meets that one. And then back over here, this goes about there, okay? So I'm going to complete the contour lines of the portrait, and then I will erase those grid lines. All right, so now that I'm done with my contour lines, I don't need the grid anymore, so I'm going to erase it so that it doesn't interfere with the drawing once I start laying in the values. So don't forget that step when you don't need the guidance of the grid anymore for those contour lines. Just use your gray kneaded eraser and just erase those contour lines or the grid lines. So now you can see the reason why I suggested drawing really light for those grid lines, because they do get erased, and it's much easier to erase lines that are very light. Now, the reason that the drawing board is important is not only to give you a flat surface while you're, to support your paper while you're drawing, but also because, as you can see, like I have my board, it's leaning up against the table here, and the bottom of the board is actually sitting on my lap. So that way I can have a perfect, view of my drawing so that things don't get warped. If my perspective would be off if I was looking at this, if it's flat, my perspective looking at it is at an angle, whereas if it's angled like this, I have a perfect straight view. So that's just to help avoid getting your proportions and things like that warped as you're drawing, because you want to make sure you have a really good view. So this is how professionals work. They would either use a drawing board like this, or they would have a drafting table that angles things for a seated position while you're drawing. Okay. All right, so I've been able to eliminate most of the grid lines, so I'm going to switch over to using my charcoal pencils. Okay, so now you're going to want your reference photo handy so that you can match the values. Don't ignore the background, because for example, if my background was like a white background in my reference, I would want to reflect that same value. A lot of students tend to ignore the backgrounds for some reason. So remember, you're gonna draw everything that's included, okay? Now, I'm gonna go ahead and start with the dark values first. I have a 2B and a 4B black charcoal pencils that I'm working with. I'm gonna just start with a 2B because that one is, it's a little bit easier to get light values with it. As you can see, it's sharpened to a long point so that I can use the side of the pencil to lay in large areas, because at this point, I'm concerned more with layering and adding value rather than drawing lines. Because I want the forms to look solid and three-dimensional. So I'm just going to look back and forth and try to match certain values. So sometimes the tone of your paper will already be the correct value, so you don't necessarily have to put any charcoal there. But if anything gets darker than the tone of your paper, you use black charcoal pencils. If anything gets lighter than the tone of your paper, like these highlight areas on the face, I would need to use my white charcoal pencil or a white pastel pencil. Okay, so I can see that there are some dark values in the hair. As you can see, I'm using the side of my charcoal pencil to lay in very light values just in the certain shapes or areas where I see those real dark areas. So if you have a photo reference that includes hair or fur, I would suggest at first treating them or those areas as shapes rather than trying to draw every individual hair. This will help it to look more realistic. Okay, let's see here. So when you're filling in a large area, make sure that you go slow. Make sure you get your pencil strokes right next to each other so you don't have a bunch of gaps in between your lines. If you have a bunch of gaps, if you're rushing, then it's going to look really messy and it's not going to look as realistic as it could if you were doing these even layers like I'm doing right now. Now keep in mind, now that you're starting to lay in value, charcoal is very soft and messy. You don't want to rest your hand on areas that already have charcoal material on the page because you could smudge it. And we're not going to use any blending tools for this project. We are only applying charcoal straight onto the paper and not blending or smudging at all. So do be careful not to rub your hand over those areas. So what I would do is if I needed to rest my hand down, I would just use, you know, a blank piece of blank paper, any kind of blank paper, just to put something under my hand so I can rest it down while I draw. Right now, my hand is kind of hovering above the page, so I am not really resting it down right now, but if I were to rest it down, I would grab a piece of paper to protect the paper while I rest my hand. So even in areas that I know need to get darker than this, I'm just getting started, and I will layer more to get darker as I go, but right now I'm just looking for any area that I feel that would get darker than this toned paper and putting one layer down, and then I will go back later and add more in areas that need to get even darker, like these glasses frames and areas in the jacket and areas like that get really, really black. I would definitely need to eventually go darker. So at that point, I might switch to my 4B because it's a little easier to go dark very quickly with a 4B. So as you can see, this part of the drawing is actually quite fun, and it's much easier than the other parts of the drawing because right now I already have a plan of what I'm doing because I already have those contour lines there as a guide. I don't have to worry about proportions or anything like that. It's already laid out for me, which is great. Now I'm noticing that we're very, very close in value. It might be slightly darker, but it's so hard to tell. They're so close. If I decide that this is actually indeed darker than my paper, then I would need to add a real light layer in the background, but I'm still trying to decide. They're so close in value. So I will decide that later, but for now, I'm making some progress on the darker values. I would approach the lighter values in the same way. So I would try to determine which areas get lighter than the tone of my paper. I would say the light side of the face there does get lighter, but it's very subtle. So I'm going to use the same technique where I use a very, very light touch. I can always go lighter if I need to layer more, but I want to start out slow. Now it's natural for the pencil material to look a little bit textured on the page. That's totally how it's supposed to look, so don't worry about that. So there's these highlight areas on the hair that I'm just adding a little bit of white to. So you don't ever want to mix the white and black charcoal together because it's going to look kind of muddy. Only use the white in areas that need to get lighter than the paper. Only use the black in areas that need to get darker than your paper. So from here, I would just layer more and more, like I mentioned with some of those real dark areas that need to get darker. I would maybe switch to my 4B, for example, these glasses frames. You'll see how much more quickly it turns to a real nice dark black with the 4B. So you really want to try to match the values and try to ignore really tiny details for as long as possible. You can always add them towards the end. Try not to get distracted by them. Try to go for the larger shapes first with filling in. You know, towards the end, if you want to do any wrinkles or little stubble or hairs or whatever you want to add, you know, you can do that at the end of the drawing, like these tiny little highlights and things like that. So obviously this is going to take quite a bit of time. So I'm going to work on this off camera, and when I get towards the end, I'm going to come back and kind of show you the finished product here. All right. Actually, one last thing here that I wanted to mention as just a little tip. If you are having trouble, if you feel like things are starting to look different, and if you feel like you're kind of getting distracted by details and stuff like that, try looking at your subject upside down. This will help you forget the subject of what you're drawing, so you won't draw what you think of how it looks. You're going to draw how it really looks, because these start looking like just abstract areas. You're not gonna think about this as a portrait. You're gonna think about this in terms of areas of value, and it will kind of help you to look at it from different angles once in a while. This is a professional artist trick. A lot of artists use this, so that could be a very helpful thing. All right, so I've got my final piece here. I just kept layering the charcoal. I used the black charcoal for any area that got darker than the value of my paper, the white charcoal in any area that gets lighter than the value of my paper. And now I'm ready to take the artist tape off. You want to be very gentle and careful with this step so as not to tear the paper. All right, right, so now as you can see, I'm left with a nice clean border all the way around my drawing. And at this point, the drawing is finished. If you have any smudges, you can clean it up with a kneaded eraser. But in general, just as a reminder, while you're drawing, you want to, if you're resting your hand down on an area that already has some charcoal, you want to keep a little piece of paper under your hand so that you don't accidentally smudge or smear the drawing. So this is what it looks like without using any blending tools, using charcoal on toned paper.